Picture this. It's November 1895, somewhere deep in the forests of northern Michigan. You're a logger, and you've just signed on for the winter season at a lumber camp operated by the Nestos Timber Company. You'll spend the next 5 months living in a crude wooden bunkhouse with 40 other men, working 6 days a week from sunup to sundown, earning maybe $1 a day if you're lucky. And there's a very real chance you won't make it home alive. Before we continue, subscribe for real forgotten history and the dangerous jobs that built the modern world. Logging camps in the late 1800s and early 1900s were scattered throughout the forested regions of North America, from Maine to Oregon, from the Great Lakes to the Appalachian Mountains. These weren't permanent settlements. They were temporary operations thrown together as quickly and cheaply as possible, designed to extract timber and move on. The companies that ran them had one priority: get as much wood out of the forest as fast as possible, and worker safety was barely an afterthought. A typical logging camp in this era consisted of a few basic structures. The bunkhouse was the largest building where all the workers slept. These were usually long, single-room buildings with rows of wooden bunks stacked too high along the walls. Heat came from a single wood stove in the center, which meant the guys near the stove roasted while the guys at the ends froze. Ventilation was minimal because keeping heat in was more important than air quality, so the air inside was thick with smoke, sweat, and the smell of wet wool and unwashed bodies. The mess hall was where everyone ate, usually attached to the bunkhouse or in a separate building nearby. Meals were served at long wooden tables, and the food was designed for one purpose: to provide calories. Breakfast was typically beans, salt pork, and bread. Lunch was beans, salt pork, and bread. Dinner was, you guessed it, beans, salt pork, and bread. Sometimes there'd be potatoes or oatmeal to mix things up. Fresh vegetables were rare because camps were often miles from the nearest town, and refrigeration didn't exist. Beyond these main buildings, there might be a small office for the foreman, a stable for the horses and oxen that hauled logs, and maybe a blacksmith shop for repairing tools and equipment. That was it. No bathrooms. You went in the woods. No showers. You waited until you got back to town. No electricity. No running water. No medical facilities beyond a first aid kit that probably contained some whiskey and dirty bandages. The men who worked in these camps came from all over. Some were locals who needed winter work when farming season ended. Others were immigrants, Scandinavians and French Canadians especially, who came to America looking for any work they could find. Some were drifters, moving from camp to camp, season to season, and a surprising number were young men, teenagers really, who saw logging as an adventure or a way to make quick money. The work itself was brutally hard. During the winter months, which was the main logging season in the northern regions, crews would cut down trees and haul them to the nearest river or railroad. In the Great Lakes region, they'd stack the logs on the frozen ground, and when spring came, they'd push them into the swollen rivers to float downstream to the sawmills. In the Pacific Northwest, where the trees were bigger and the terrain steeper, they used different methods, but the basic idea was the same: cut, move, transport. Every aspect of this work was dangerous, but we'll get to the specifics in a moment. What's important to understand first is the context in which this danger existed. These camps operated in remote locations, often days away from the nearest doctor or hospital. Communication with the outside world was limited to occasional mail delivery or supply runs. If something went wrong, if someone got hurt or sick, help was not coming quickly. Though companies that ran these camps had enormous power over the men who worked in them. Most loggers were paid at the end of the season, not weekly or daily. If you left early or got fired, you might not get paid at all. Some camps operated company stores where workers could buy supplies on credit, which would be deducted from their final pay. This created a system where men could work an entire season and end up owing the company money instead of taking anything home. Labor laws, as we understand them today, barely existed in the late 1800s. There was no OSHA, no workers' compensation, no requirement for companies to provide safe working conditions. If you got hurt on the job, that was your problem, not the company's. If you died, well, there were plenty more men looking for work. The companies had no financial incentive to invest in safety, and in many cases, they actively resisted any attempts to regulate their operations. This combination of factors, dangerous work, remote locations, poor living conditions, inadequate medical care, and complete lack of worker protections, created an environment where death and serious injury were not just possible, but common. The question wasn't if someone would get hurt during a logging season. It was how many people would get hurt and how badly. And here's the thing that's hardest to wrap your head around from a modern perspective. Everyone knew how dangerous it was. The loggers knew, the foremen knew, the company owners knew. But the work continued anyway because the economic forces driving the timber industry were so powerful that individual human lives were treated as an acceptable cost of doing business. The term widow maker referred to any dead or damaged branch, limb, or tree that could fall without warning and kill whoever was underneath. In a logging camp, widow makers were everywhere, and they were responsible for a significant portion of the deaths that occurred in the woods. When you're cutting down a massive, old-growth tree, especially the kind of trees that existed in the late 1800s before intensive logging depleted the forests, you're dealing with something that can weigh several tons and stand 150 feet tall or more. The process of felling a tree was done entirely by hand with cross-cut saws, which meant two men working in sync, pulling a long saw back and forth through the trunk. It could take hours to bring down a single large tree. The physics of a falling tree are complex and unpredictable. You'd make a notch cut on the side where you wanted the tree to fall, then saw through from the opposite side, leaving a small hinge of wood to control the direction. In theory, the tree would fall exactly where you planned. In practice, trees had their own ideas about where they wanted to go. A tree might have internal rot that wasn't visible from the outside, which could cause it to break unpredictably when it started to fall. It might catch on other trees on the way down, creating a hanger that could drop at any moment. The top might break off and come straight down like a spear, while the main trunk fell in a different direction, and sometimes the tree would kick back off the stump, something called a barber chair, where the trunk splits vertically and a massive piece of wood shoots backward with enough force to kill instantly. Let me give you a specific example. In January of 1903, a logger named Eric Lindstrom was working in a camp near Duluth, Minnesota. He and his partner had just finished cutting through a large white pine, and the tree was starting to fall. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, but about halfway down, the tree hit another tree, and the top 20 feet broke off. That section came down like a javelin and struck Lindstrom in the head. He died instantly. His partner, who was standing just 15 feet away, was completely unharmed. That's how random and arbitrary it could be. But widowmakers weren't just about the tree you were actively cutting. The forest itself was full of hazards. Previous logging operations would leave behind damaged trees that looked fine, but were actually dead or dying. Wind, rot, and ice would create hanging limbs that could drop at any moment. In winter, ice would build up on branches, adding weight until something gave way. There are documented cases of loggers being killed by falling ice formations that weighed hundreds of pounds. The companies did virtually nothing to mitigate these risks. There was no system for identifying hazardous trees and removing them before they became a problem. There was no training on how to spot the warning signs of an unstable tree. The attitude was basically, pay attention and try not to die, because we're not slowing down production to make things safer. In the Pacific Northwest, where the trees were even larger, the dangers were proportionally greater. Douglas firs and redwoods that were 300 feet tall and 10 feet in diameter were being cut by men with handsaws. When one of these giants fell, it would hit the ground with such force that it could shatter, sending massive splinters flying in all directions like shrapnel. Loggers called these sliver storms, and they could be just as deadly as the falling tree itself. One particularly grim account comes from a camp in Oregon in 1908. A crew was working on taking down a massive Douglas fir, and when it finally fell, it hit the ground so hard that it bounced. The impact was strong enough that a nearby tree, which had been damaged but still standing, came down as well. 3 men were killed by flying debris, and 2 others were seriously injured. The worst part is that this was considered just another day in the woods. The company paid for basic funerals, deducted the cost from the crew's wages, and had new workers in camp within a week. The statistical reality was sobering. In the peak years of logging, roughly between 1880 and 1910, falling objects accounted for somewhere between 40 and 50% of all logging deaths. We don't have perfect records because many deaths went unreported, especially if they happened in remote camps where the company could simply bury the body and move on. But the records we do have paint a clear picture. If you worked in the woods long enough, you were going to see someone killed by a falling tree or branch. And yet, despite knowing the risks, men continued to take these jobs. For many, it was the only work available. For others, the pay, as meager as it was better than what they could make farming or doing other manual labor. Some men were genuinely skilled at the work and took pride in their ability to survive in such a dangerous environment. But make no mistake, they were surviving despite the conditions, not because of any safety measures the companies provided. The dark humor that loggers developed around widowmakers was a coping mechanism. They'd give particularly dangerous trees names, joke about which one would get them, make wagers about who would have the next close call. It wasn't that they didn't take the danger seriously. It's that when you're facing constant mortal risk, you either find a way to laugh about it or you go insane from fear. If this story has you hooked so far, make sure you're subscribed. There's much more ahead. The equipment used in logging camps during this era was primitive, poorly maintained, and dangerous by design. Every tool a logger used had the potential to maim or kill, and equipment failures were a leading cause of injuries and deaths. Let's start with the basic tools. The crosscut saw, which was the primary tool for felling trees, was a 6 to 8 foot blade with teeth on both sides. 2 men would pull it back and forth through a tree trunk, and if the saw bound up, which happened frequently, the sudden release of tension could send the blade whipping around with enough force to sever limbs or slash arteries. The teeth on. These saws were designed to cut wood, but they cut flesh just as easily. Axes were just as dangerous. A logger working on limbing a fallen tree would swing an axe hundreds of times a day, and all it took was one slip, one moment of fatigue or inattention for that blade to end up in a leg or foot instead of the tree. The axes weren't sharp in the way a kitchen knife is sharp. They were sharp the way a razor blade is sharp, because that's what it took to cut through the hardwood and softwood species they were harvesting. In the winter camps of the Great Lakes region, many crews used ice saws to cut channels in frozen rivers, preparing for the spring log drive. These were similar to crosscut saws, but designed specifically for ice. The work was done in freezing temperatures, often on unstable ice, and if you fell through, your chances of survival were minimal. There are records of entire crews being lost when the ice gave way unexpectedly. But hand tools, as dangerous as they were, weren't the worst of it. As technology advanced in the late 1800s and early 1900s, logging camps began adopting steam-powered equipment that made the work faster and exponentially more dangerous. The steam donkey, which was essentially a portable steam engine with a cable spool, revolutionized how logs were moved, but it also created entirely new ways for men to die. The way a steam donkey worked was simple in concept, but deadly in practice. You'd attach a steel cable to a log. The steam engine would wind up the cable, and the log would be dragged through the forest to a loading area. The cables under tension could snap without warning, and when a steel cable under several tons of tension breaks, it whips through the air faster than you can react. Men were decapitated, cut in half, or had limbs torn off by snapping cables. In 1912, a logger named Thomas Callahan was working at a camp in Washington state, operating a steam donkey. The cable they were using had been repaired multiple times, spliced back together after previous breaks because new cable was expensive, and the company didn't want to replace it until absolutely necessary. On a cold morning in February, the cable snapped under load. The loose end whipped back and struck Callahan in the chest. The impact broke his ribs and punctured his lungs. He died 3 hours later, drowning in his own blood, while the crew stood around helpless because the nearest doctor was 2 days away by horse. Cable breaks were so common that experienced loggers developed a sixth sense about when to get clear. They'd watch the cable for signs of fraying, listen to the sound the steam donkey made, feel the rhythm of the operation. When something felt off, they'd move. But new workers, who made up a significant portion of the workforce because the turnover was so high, didn't have that experience. They'd stand in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that would be it. The companies knew the cables were dangerous, They knew that regular inspection and replacement would save lives, but cables were expensive and loggers were cheap. The math, from a purely economic standpoint, favored letting men die rather than investing in better equipment, and there was no law forcing them to do otherwise. Beyond steam donkeys, there were other mechanical hazards. Log loaders, which used cranes and chains to lift logs onto railroad cars, were notorious for crushing injuries. The chains would slip, the logs would roll, and someone would end up underneath several tons of wood. Sawmills, which were often part of larger logging operations, had their own set of deadly equipment. Circular saws that spun at hundreds of revolutions per minute, conveyor belts that could catch clothing and pull someone into machinery, stacks of lumber that could collapse without warning. One of the grimmest aspects of equipment-related deaths was how preventable many of them were. A lot of the failures happened because equipment wasn't properly maintained, not because it was inherently unsafe. Steam engines needed regular inspection and maintenance to operate safely, but that took time and money. Cables needed to be replaced when they showed signs of wear, but again, that cost money. Tools needed to be kept sharp and in good repair, but sharpening stones and replacement handles were expenses that cut into profit, so the companies took shortcuts. They ran equipment past the point where it should have been retired. They patched and repaired instead of replacing. They pushed everything to the absolute limit, and when something finally failed, it failed catastrophically and someone died. Then they'd do the bare minimum to fix the immediate problem and go right back to operating the same way. The loggers themselves often had to provide their own tools, which created another layer of risk. If you were poor, which most loggers were, you'd buy the cheapest axe or saw you could find, and cheap tools were more likely to fail. Some companies provided tools, but charged the workers for them, deducting the cost from their wages, which meant men were paying for the privilege of working with equipment that might kill them. There's a certain grim irony in the fact that the tools and machines designed to make logging more efficient were also the things that made it more deadly. As the industry modernized and production increased, so did the body count. The companies were making more money than ever, extracting more timber, building bigger operations. But the men doing the actual work weren't any safer. If anything, they were in more danger because the pace of work had increased and the pressure to produce was greater than ever. Once the trees were cut and the logs were ready for transport, they had to get to the sawmills, and in many parts of the country, that meant river driving. This was the process of pushing millions of logs into rivers and floating them downstream to processing facilities. It was also one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire logging industry, and it killed more men than almost any other single activity. River driving typically happened in the spring when melting snow and ice caused rivers to swell with runoff. The high water and fast current were necessary to move the massive volume of logs, but those same conditions made the work incredibly hazardous. The men who did this work, called river drivers or river pigs, spent weeks or months working on floating logs, using long poles with metal hooks to keep the logs moving and prevent jams. The basic risk was drowning. You're standing on logs that are floating in cold, fast-moving water, using a 6-foot pole to maneuver other logs around you, and if you slip, you fall in. The water temperature in spring-fed northern rivers was often barely above freezing, which meant hypothermia would set in within minutes, even if you were a strong swimmer, which many loggers weren't. The cold water would quickly sap your strength, but drowning from simply falling in the water was almost the best-case scenario, as horrible as that sounds. The real nightmare was getting caught between logs. When logs are floating in a river, they're constantly bumping into each other, grinding together with thousands of pounds of force. If you fell in and got caught between two logs, you'd be crushed. If you got pinned underwater, you'd drown before anyone could free you. The river drivers carried long pikes that they'd sometimes use to try to push logs apart to rescue someone, but more often than not, by the time they could react, it was too late. Let me tell you about Peter Bergeron, a river driver who worked the St. Croix River in Wisconsin in the 1890s. In May of 1897, Bergeron was working on breaking up a small jam when he slipped on a wet log. He fell into the water, and before he could surface, two logs collided right where he'd gone under. His crew members saw what happened, and they tried to separate the logs, but it took took them nearly 5 minutes to create enough space. When they finally pulled Bergeron out, he'd been underwater the entire time. He was dead, and his body showed massive crush injuries from the pressure of the logs. The companies that employed river drivers provided virtually no safety equipment. There were no life jackets, no safety lines, no boats following the crews in case someone fell in. You had the clothes on your back, a pair of boots with metal spikes in the soles to help you grip the logs, and your pike pole. That was it. The company's attitude was that if you couldn't handle the work, you shouldn't be doing it, which conveniently absolved them of any responsibility for your safety. Log jams were a constant problem during river drives, and they were particularly deadly. A jam would form when logs got tangled up and blocked the river, causing a massive pileup upstream. Breaking a jam required finding the key logs that were holding everything together and pulling them free, which would cause the entire mass to suddenly release and surge downstream. The men doing this work had to be on the jam itself when it broke, and they'd have only seconds to get clear before thousands of logs started moving. Many didn't make it. In April of 1902, a massive jam formed on the Penobscot River in Maine. The jam was estimated to contain over 100,000 logs, creating a pile that was 20 feet high in places and backed up the river for miles. A crew of 30 river drivers spent 3 days working on it, using dynamite and pike poles to try to break it apart. On the 3rd day, they finally found the key logs, and when they pulled them free, the jam exploded into motion. Most of the crew made it to shore in time, but 6 men were still on the logs when the mass started moving. 3 of them managed to ride the logs safely downstream, using their skill and experience to stay on top of the chaos. The other 3 were pulled under and crushed. Their bodies weren't recovered for weeks, and when they were finally found miles downstream, they were so badly damaged from being ground between logs that identification was difficult. The interesting and depressing thing about river driving was that the men who did it were considered elite workers within the logging industry. They were paid slightly more than regular loggers because the work was so dangerous and required so much skill. You had to have incredible balance, quick reflexes, and the ability to read the water and predict how logs would move. These weren't unskilled laborers. They were specialists, and the companies still treated their lives as expendable. Another aspect of river driving that made it so deadly was the sheer duration of the work. A river drive could last anywhere from a few weeks to several months, depending on how far the logs had to travel and how many jams formed along the way. The men would follow the logs downstream, sleeping in makeshift camps along the riverbank, eating whatever food the supply boats brought them, working from dawn until dark every day. The fatigue alone was a risk factor. When you're exhausted, cold, and hungry, your judgment suffers and your reaction time slows down, which makes you more likely to make a fatal mistake. Companies would sometimes hire local residents along the river to provide meals and basic supplies to the river driving crews, but these arrangements were informal and unreliable. There are accounts of river drivers going days without adequate food because the supply boat didn't show up or the river was too dangerous to navigate. Men working under those conditions, already dealing with the physical demands and dangers of the job, were operating at the absolute edge of their capacity. The death toll from river driving is difficult to quantify precisely because, like other logging operations, many deaths went unreported or were poorly documented. But estimates suggest that during the peak era of river driving, roughly from the 1870s through the 1910s, several hundred men died each year in river driving accidents across the United States and Canada. That's hundreds of men per year drowning, being crushed, or dying from exposure and exhaustion, all to move logs from the forest to the mill. If the work itself didn't kill you, the living conditions and complete absence of proper medical care might finish the job. Disease and infection were constant threats in logging camps, and the companies did virtually nothing to prevent or treat them. The bunkhouses where loggers lived were perfect environments for disease transmission. 40 or 50 men sleeping in a single room with poor ventilation, no running water, and limited opportunities for basic hygiene meant that when one person got sick, everyone got sick. Respiratory illnesses like pneumonia, tuberculosis, and influenza spread rapidly through camps, especially in winter when everyone was packed inside to escape the cold. Tuberculosis, which people called consumption in those days, was a particular problem. It's a bacterial infection that spreads through the air when infected people cough or sneeze, and in the close quarters of a logging camp, it could rip through the workforce. The disease causes severe coughing, weight loss, fever, and eventually, if untreated, death. In the late 1800s, there was no cure for tuberculosis, and treatment options were limited to rest and fresh air, neither of which were available in a logging camp where you were expected to work 6 days a week, regardless of how you felt. There are documented cases of entire camps being devastated by tuberculosis outbreaks. In the winter of 1889, a camp in northern Minnesota, run by the Crookston Lumber Company, lost 17 men to what was almost certainly tuberculosis. Though the exact diagnosis is unclear from historical records, the company's response was to burn down the bunkhouse to prevent further spread, which was actually not a terrible idea, given their lack of medical knowledge. But they didn't provide any compensation to the families of the dead men or offer any medical care to those who survived. Beyond respiratory diseases, gastrointestinal illnesses were also common. Typhoid fever, cholera, and dysentery could spread through camps when water sources became contaminated with human waste. Remember, there were no toilets or sewage systems in these camps. Everyone went to the bathroom in the woods, and if the camp was near a stream that also served as the water source, which was often the case, contamination was almost inevitable. The food situation didn't help. The diet of beans, salt pork, and bread wasn't just monotonous, it was nutritionally inadequate. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a real problem in camps that went months without fresh fruits or vegetables. Scurvy causes fatigue, bleeding gums, loosening teeth, and if left untreated, death. It's the same disease that killed sailors on long ocean voyages, and it killed loggers for the same reason: no access to fresh food. But perhaps more than disease itself, it was the complete absence of medical care that made camps so deadly. When someone got seriously ill or injured, there was usually no one in camp with any medical training. The best you could hope for was that someone had worked as a medic in the military or had some folk medicine knowledge passed down from family. More often, treatment consisted of whiskey for pain, maybe some crude bandaging, and a lot of hoping the person either recovered on their own or died quickly so they wouldn't suffer. Infections from injuries were a major killer. A relatively minor cut or puncture wound that today would be treated with antibiotics and be fine could, in a logging camp, turn into a life-threatening infection. Gangrene was common, where tissue dies and becomes infected, often requiring amputation to save the person's life. But amputations performed in camp without anesthesia, sterile instruments, or proper technique were essentially death sentences that just took a little longer to execute. Let me tell you about a case from 1905 that illustrates how bad things could get. A logger named Joseph Bélanger was working in a camp in northern Wisconsin when he stepped on a rusty saw blade that someone had left lying in the snow. The blade went through his boot and into his foot, creating a deep puncture wound. The camp foreman poured whiskey on the wound, wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn from a shirt, and sent Bélanger back to work the next day because they were behind on their cutting quota. Within 3 days, Bélanger's foot was swollen and discolored. Within a week, red streaks were visible running up his leg, a clear sign of blood poisoning. The foreman finally agreed to send him to the nearest town, which was a 2-day journey by horse-drawn sled. Bélanger died on the way there. A doctor who examined the body later said that with proper immediate treatment, the injury would have been completely treatable. But by the time Bélanger left camp, the infection was so advanced that even amputation wouldn't have saved him. The companies had no legal obligation to provide medical care, and most of them didn't. Some larger companies might keep a basic first aid kit in camp, and a very few even employed a camp doctor or nurse, but these were the exception rather than the rule. The vast majority of logging operations provided nothing, and when a worker got sick or injured, the attitude was that it was his problem to solve. This created a situation where men would often hide injuries or illnesses because they knew that if they couldn't work, they wouldn't get paid, and they might even get sent away from camp without the wages they'd already earned. So they'd work through fevers, work with infected wounds, work with broken bones that hadn't been properly set, all because admitting they needed help could mean economic disaster for their families. The isolation of the camps made everything worse. Even in cases where a company might have been willing to get medical help for a seriously ill or injured worker, the logistics of actually doing so were daunting. Many camps were located days away from the nearest town with a doctor. Transportation options were limited to horse-drawn wagons or sleds, which moved slowly over rough terrain. In winter, blizzards could make travel impossible for weeks at a time. There are heartbreaking accounts of men dying from treatable conditions simply because they couldn't get to a doctor in time. Appendicitis, which today is a routine surgery, was a death sentence in a remote logging camp. Broken bones that became infected, severe burns from camp stoves or forest fires, head injuries from falling objects. All of these could be survived with proper medical care, but in a logging camp, they were often fatal. The companies saved money by not providing medical care, and they faced no legal consequences for this neglect. It wasn't until the early 1900s that workers' compensation laws began to be passed in various states, requiring companies to provide some level of insurance coverage for workplace injuries. But these laws were often weakly enforced, especially in remote areas, and many companies simply ignored them. While the work itself was inherently dangerous, a significant portion of the deaths and injuries in logging camps weren't inevitable. They were the direct result of company policies that prioritize profit over human life. The companies knew the risks. They knew what could be done to make things safer, and they chose not to do it because it would cost money. Let's talk about working hours. In the peak years of logging, a typical workday ran from first light to last light, which in winter could be relatively short, but in summer meant 12 to 14 hours of hard physical labor. Workers got one day off per week, usually Sunday, and even then, they were often expected to spend that day maintaining equipment or doing other camp chores. The companies pushed for maximum production, which meant men were working while exhausted, and exhausted workers make mistakes. There are documented cases of loggers falling asleep while working, literally so tired that they'd doze off while standing or sitting on a log. One account from a Michigan camp in 1898 describes a logger who fell asleep while sitting on a stack of logs waiting to be loaded. He slumped over in his sleep and fell 15 feet to the ground, breaking his back. He survived, but was paralyzed from the waist down, and the company didn't provide any compensation or support. The companies could have implemented reasonable shifts and mandatory rest periods. They could have hired larger crews so that no individual worker was pushed to the point of dangerous fatigue, but that would have cost more money, and the companies weren't interested. The attitude was that if you couldn't handle the work, someone else could, and there was always a line of desperate men willing to take your place. Pay was another form of exploitation that directly contributed to the danger. Most loggers were paid at the end of the season, which could be 4 or 5 months of work, before they saw any money. This created a situation where men were essentially trapped in the camps, because leaving meant forfeiting all the wages they'd earned so far. Even if conditions were unsafe, even if men were dying around you, you couldn't afford to quit. Some companies paid in scrip instead of actual money, basically company-issued currency that could only be used at the company store. The company would set the prices at the store, often charging far more than what the same goods would cost in town, and workers would end up spending all their scrip on basic necessities. By the end of the season, they'd have worked for months and have nothing to show for it, except debts to the company. This system was used deliberately to keep workers dependent and compliant. If you complained about safety conditions, if you tried to organize other workers, if you caused any trouble at all, the company could fire you and you'd lose everything. It was economic coercion, and it meant that workers had no real power to demand safer conditions. The lack of safety equipment was another clear example of how companies put profit over lives. Basic safety gear that could have prevented many deaths and injuries. Things like rope and harnesses for working at heights, protective eyewear for loggers working near flying wood chips, insulated clothing for winter work simply wasn't provided. Workers were expected to provide their own gear, and most couldn't afford anything beyond the bare minimum. When steam-powered equipment was introduced, the companies could have invested in training programs to teach workers how to operate and work around this machinery safely. They could have implemented safety protocols, like keeping all workers clear when cables were under tension, or requiring inspection of equipment before each use. But training took time, and protocols slowed down production, so most companies did neither. They'd show a worker how to operate a steam donkey once, maybe twice if he was lucky, and then expect him to figure out the rest on his own. The companies also fought against any attempts at regulation or worker organization. When workers tried to form unions to demand better conditions, companies would bring in strike breakers, fire the organizers, or even use violence to suppress organizing efforts. The lumber barons, as the big company owners were called, had enormous political and economic power, and they used it to prevent any laws that might cut into their profits. It's important to understand that the men running these companies weren't cartoon villains. They were businessmen operating within a capitalist system that rewarded maximizing profit and provided no penalties for worker deaths. In their minds, they were simply running efficient operations. The fact that their efficiency was built on human suffering and death was to them just the cost of doing business in a competitive industry, but the human cost was staggering. During the peak years of logging, from roughly 1880 to 1910, it's estimated that several thousand loggers died each year in the United States and Canada combined. That's thousands of men, many of them young, cut down in their prime because the companies they worked for cared more about timber production than human life. And for every death, there were probably 10 or 20 serious injuries. Men who lost limbs were permanently disabled or suffered chronic health problems from the work. The families of these men received nothing. If your husband or father or brother died in a logging camp, the company might pay for a basic funeral, or they might not. They certainly weren't going to provide any financial support to his widow and children. The family would be left destitute, which is why they called those falling branches widowmakers. It wasn't just a description of what killed the man, it was a description of what happened to his family afterward. Some companies were worse than others. There were a few operations, usually smaller family-owned businesses, that did make genuine efforts to provide safer conditions and fair treatment for their workers. But these were the exception. The large timber companies that dominated the industry operated on a model of extracting maximum value while externalizing costs onto workers and communities. They got rich, their shareholders got rich, and the men who actually did the work paid for it with their bodies and their lives. This wasn't a secret. Newspaper articles from the era document the death rates in logging camps. Government officials knew what was happening. Reform advocates and early labor organizers were shouting about it, but change came slowly because the companies had the money and the political power to resist it. Change, when it finally came, didn't happen because companies suddenly developed a conscience. It happened because of a combination of factors: workers organizing and fighting for better conditions, progressive era reforms, the rise of workers' compensation laws, and eventually, the simple economic calculation that too many workplace deaths were starting to affect the labor supply and the industry's reputation. The first real improvements came in the 1910s and 1920s. Several states passed workers' compensation laws that required companies to carry insurance for workplace injuries and deaths. This didn't make the work safe, but it at least meant that if you died or were seriously injured, your family might receive some financial compensation. Companies fought these laws tooth and nail, but progressive reformers, backed by growing public outrage over industrial working conditions, managed to push them through. Workers' compensation had an interesting secondary effect. Insurance companies, who now had to pay out for workplace injuries, started pressuring logging companies to implement safety measures because safer operations meant fewer claims, which meant lower premiums. Suddenly, safety wasn't just a moral issue, it was an economic one, and companies responded to economic incentives. Safety equipment started becoming more common in camps. Loggers began receiving basic training on how to spot hazardous trees and avoid widowmakers. Companies started inspecting equipment more regularly and replacing worn-out cables and tools before they failed catastrophically. These changes didn't happen everywhere or all at once, but by the 1920s, working conditions in logging camps were noticeably better than they had been in the 1890s. The introduction of gasoline-powered equipment, particularly chainsaws in the 1920s and 1930s, also changed the nature of the work. Chainsaws were dangerous in their own right, but they were faster and more controllable than crosscut saws, which meant loggers spent less time on each tree and had more ability to control how it fell. Mechanized log loaders and trucks for transporting timber reduced the reliance on river driving, which eliminated one of the most dangerous aspects of the entire operation. Medical care improved as well, though slowly. By the 1920s, larger logging operations were starting to employ camp doctors or nurses, and companies were more willing to transport seriously injured workers to hospitals. The development of antibiotics in the 1940s dramatically reduced deaths from infections, which had previously been a major killer. Labor unions also played a crucial role. The industrial workers of the world, known as the Woolbleys, organized logging camps throughout the Pacific Northwest in the 1910s and 1920s, demanding better pay, shorter hours, and safer working conditions. The companies fought back violently, but the unions persisted, and they achieved some significant victories that improved conditions for all loggers, not just union members. But here's the thing, even with all these improvements, logging remained one of the most dangerous occupations in America. The death rate declined from the horrific levels of the late 1800s, but it was still far higher than almost any other industry. In the 1950s, decades after the worst abuses had been addressed, logging was still killing hundreds of workers per year. Today, modern logging operations bear little resemblance to the camps of the past. There are strict safety regulations enforced by OSHA. Workers wear hard hats, safety goggles, and protective clothing. Equipment is required to meet safety standards and undergo regular inspection. There are mandatory training programs, emergency medical services, and legal protections for workers who report unsafe conditions. And yet, even with all of this, logging is still consistently ranked as one of the most dangerous jobs in America. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that logging workers have one of the highest rates of fatal occupational injuries of any profession. The work itself, cutting down massive trees in remote locations, remains inherently dangerous. The difference is that modern loggers have protections and support that their predecessors could barely imagine. The forests that were logged in the late 1800s and early 1900s are mostly gone now. The old-growth timber that once covered much of North America was cut down to build cities, railroads, and the infrastructure of an industrializing nation. The wood from those trees is in buildings that are still standing today, in houses, churches, and businesses scattered across the country. But every board, every beam, every piece of that wood came at a human cost. Thousands of men died extracting that timber from the forests and moving it to market. Thousands more were injured, disabled, or sickened by the work. Their names are mostly forgotten. There are no comprehensive records of who they were, where they came from, or what happened to their families after they died. Some logging communities have small museums or historical markers that acknowledge the dangers of the old camps. There are a few cemeteries in northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, with sections dedicated to loggers, rows of simple headstones marking men who died far from home, doing brutal work for minimal pay. But for the most part, their stories have been lost to time. What we can remember is that the timber industry that built America did so on the backs of these men, and that the companies that profited from their labor treated them as expendable. We can remember that the safety regulations we take for granted today were won through the suffering and deaths of workers who had no protections. And we can remember that the fight for worker safety and fair treatment isn't ancient history. It's an ongoing struggle, and the victories of the past need to be defended against those who would roll them back in the name of profit. The logging camps of the past were death traps, not because the work had to be that dangerous, but because the people who ran the industry chose to value timber over human life. That choice was enabled by a system that gave companies enormous power and workers almost none. It took decades of organizing, legislation, and social pressure to change that system. And even now, the work isn't finished. If there's a lesson in this history, it's that worker safety doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen because companies suddenly decide to do the right thing. It happens because workers demand it, because laws require it, and because society decides that human lives are worth more than profit margins. The loggers who died in those camps didn't have that protection. but their deaths helped create the protections that exist today. That's a legacy worth remembering. For more true history documentaries like this, subscribe to the channel. New stories every day.